love to hear it in a pastoral way more than a lecture. And so what I want to do this morning is really probably both. There will be parts that will look like we're taking a bit of a lecture approach because we need to take a biblical theological approach. But the overall gist is to take a pastoral approach. And so when Dennis came to me and said that he wanted me to look at what is the gospel, first session in the Old Testament and then the second session in the New Testament, my immediate thought was the book of Hebrews. I thought it would be good to answer the question, what is the gospel, in the context of a New Testament letter, which obviously had to go back and give the understanding from an Old Testament perspective and then give it in a present understanding within the New Testament. So that's what we're going to do. First session is the Old Testament perspective, second session New Testament perspective, but both sessions is from the book of Hebrews. Does that sound okay? All right, well, it was a rhetorical question. I have a choice. So take your Bible and go to the book of Hebrews. Book of Hebrews. And again, I want you to see this in, for lack of a better term, in action. Again, this is not some cerebral exercise. We need to do an exposition so we can pull out the gospel in a context. And perhaps, you know what? A context that perhaps isn't our very own specifically, but in a general sense, might be the context in the near future. And I say that if you understand anything about the book of Hebrews was written at a time where the recipients, we'll call them Jewish Christians. Obviously they were Christians. He's writing to people that have faith. And part of the gist of writing Hebrews was to strengthen their faith. There's a couple verses that could encapsulate the book of Hebrews. One would be, it is finished. You know, Jesus says that, right, from the cross. It is finished. These are Jewish Christians who are thinking about going back to Judaism, back to the Levitical sacrifices. And obviously he wants to get the point across that it is finished once for all. There's no point going back to that system because, one, it's all going to be demolished in a few years. In 70 AD, the temple's demolished. But apart from that, Christ has come to abolish that system, and he has fulfilled it. It is finished. The other verse, you might say, that fits the book of Hebrews, if they understood that, would be, we walk by faith and not by sight. You know that in 1 Corinthians 5? We walk by faith, not by sight. And today, you have to add we walk by faith and not by feelings. Too many people, Christians, live their whole life by feelings. And that's the world, isn't it? Well, you have this person over here who's biologically a guy, but he wants to be a woman based on what? Not on sight, not on facts, but based on what? I just feel. We are feeling driven, and that's partly because we live in a world that is driven by optics, fashion, and camera, right? We are media driven. As Christians, we got to pull back from that and be biblical. And that's why I say this is very relevant, because if we're going to walk by faith and not by sight, we have to be factual driven. We have to be driven by the text. I'm not saying feelings aren't bad. Don't get me wrong. Feelings are okay, but feelings don't drive us. It's faith that drives us. We walk by faith. And these Christians, and again, he even says, I think you're Christians. You're just a bit sluggish. You're a bit immature. Remember in Hebrews 10, he says that some of you have been forsaking the assembly. Remember, some of you aren't even coming to church. So what's going on? Why did the writer of Hebrews, and you're saying, well, who is the writer of Hebrews? I don't know. There's a lot of guesses. Some say the Apostle Paul, some say Luke, some say Barnabas, some say Apollos. It doesn't matter. Whoever he was, he was a pastor. He put the pastor hat on. He wrote to these people because he was concerned. At the end of the letter, he says, this is a short word of exhortation. I love that, especially as a preacher. 14, 15 chapters later. It's just a short word. But he wants to encourage them to strengthen their faith and to remind them of the centrality of the gospel. If you are going to move forward, if you're going to walk by faith, we need to strengthen your faith. How do you strengthen your faith? Well, primarily, I want you to get this. There's two key ways that he does this. If you were to take a step back and look at the book of Hebrews in a bird's eye view, has anybody here read Hebrews lately? Don't tell me you're preaching through Hebrews and this is all redundant. No, okay. All right. Have you guys read Hebrews lately? Or do you remember the book of Hebrews? We'll look at Hebrews, a particular text in a moment, but it could be difficult, especially if you're a new Christian. Why? Because there's a lot of Old Testament references, right? He's always going back to the Old Testament, Old Testament, Old Testament. So if you don't have a grasp on the Old Testament, it's really going to be difficult to understand the book of Hebrews. But this is why I said earlier, this is to Jewish Christians. These are Christians who converted out of Judaism, that want to go back to Judaism. Why do they want to go back to Judaism? And that's why I say the relevance here for us is pretty good, because one, there was persecution. I'm not saying any of us are persecuted. Maybe you are. But I think it'll be ramped up pretty soon. I saw in Victoria, they passed that suppression and change law. Everybody familiar with that? Where you can go to jail and pay thousands of dollars for trying to convert, a homosexual out of his homosexuality. And there's a clause in there, even if you're in New South Wales, if you're talking on the phone to a guy or girl in Victoria. That's just the beginning. It's going to get ramped up. And so there's persecution. Nero, Emperor Nero's on the throne. You know anything about Nero? You've probably heard of Nero. Nero threw the Christians to the lions, and he kind of dipped them into gasoline and lit them on fire in his backyard to make them kind of human candles. It's a ruthless dude, ruthless guy. As a Christian, I get it. Nobody wants to be thrown to the lions. Nobody wants to be burnt as a candle. I don't know if I want to be a Christian. I don't know if I'm ready to sign up for this thing. And so there's waffling. There's hesitation. The Christian is all about what? Pressing forward, right? It's all about perseverance. They're vacillating. They're waffling. They're backsliding, if not the fear of apostatizing, right? In fact, as you move through the book of Hebrews, there's two key themes throughout the whole book. And I think this will help you. Amidst all the specific stuff, taking a step back, there's two big general themes, and that is, if I'm going to get them to walk by faith and not by sight, I need to let them know that Christ is sufficient. I need to let them know that Christ is supreme. I need to let them know that the gospel is all they need. That's one thought, by the way. The supremacy of Christ. When you move through the letter, what do you see? Christ is what? Better than, better than, better than, better than. And I'll get more specific exactly what he's better than in a moment. But there's something else tied to it. 5 times there's what? Warnings. That's how you would look at the book of Hebrews, as a big picture. Christ is better, Christ is better, Christ is better, Christ is better. You look to him. You're being persecuted? Oh, by the way, there's not just persecution, there's pressure. Pressure from who? Pressure from the family. Any of you guys get saved out of a family that held to another religion? You come out of a family that's Muslim? You come out of a family that's Jewish, like these guys? Or whatever the religion is, Buddhism? Major pressure from that family, yeah? That's huge. You're coming out of that family because in a shame culture, you just place shame on the family, right? And sometimes it's to the point where they'll kill you just to alleviate that shame. So these people, these Jewish Christians, have persecution on them, pressure. Persecution from the state, pressure from the family. So how are you going to encourage them? By the way, quick footnote. You know somebody that's waffling? You know somebody that's a bit discouraged? You know somebody that maybe it's not persecution, maybe it's not pressure, maybe it's just the struggle with the flesh, the struggle, the world's pulling them back. Maybe they just can't have any victory over sin. Maybe there's just giving in to temptation after temptation. They're not really sure about this whole thing, this whole Christian thing and pursuing Christ. What do you say to them? Again, it's not persecution or pressure from family. So, but we all know people that are discouraged. We all know all people that are waffling. If you were to put your biblical counseling hat on and come alongside them, how would you counsel them? Can I suggest to you that the paradigm that I just gave you from the book of Hebrews is the exact same thing that you do? You come alongside and you do what? You point them to Christ. You point them to Christ and you tell them that Christ is sufficient and his gospel is sufficient. Right? But what you also need to tell them is that there is grave consequences if you reject Christ. You need to warn them. In fact, so serious are the warnings in the book of Hebrews is that, you know what? It would have been better for you to have never heard the gospel than to hear the gospel, say that you are a Christian, come and then reject it all, apostatize. The judgment will be greater on you than somebody that has never heard of it. Why? Because the greater the light that has been given to you, the greater the responsibilities and the accountabilities. Do you understand that point? Remember, Jesus says, "Woe to you, Chorazin and Tyre." Why? It would have been better for Sodom and Gomorrah. What do you mean, better for Sodom? I thought those guys, God destroyed them because of a homosexuality. Well, guess what? They didn't have the light like you guys had. They don't have the Son of God walking and proclaiming to you guys like they did. So that's the warnings. The warnings are there's grave consequence, great judgment. And that's part of the gospel. You understand that, right? Part of the gospel is turn to Christ or else. There's bad news and there's good news. And so that's what you have to do as you come alongside somebody that's discouraged and gently point them to Christ. How many times does the writer of Hebrews says, look to him, consider him. It's all about him. And so that's the flow of the book of Hebrews. But you also have to give the warnings that, hey, if you reject him, there's grave consequences. Walk by faith, not by sight. Walk by the gospel. Secure yourself in the gospel. Know the gospel. Can I just add another thought before we really get into the text? We live in a day and age where the church tries to make the church members anything but gospel ministers. I'll even take it further. Bible colleges make the men that go through the Bible colleges anything but gospel ministers. They make them CEOs, they make them administrative clowns, for lack of a better term off the top of my head. But where are those places where all we do is to train men? When we say train men for the ministry, what kind of ministry are we training them for? We're training them to be gospel ministers. I don't know if you have a chance to read old books. When I say old, 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, especially in the Puritan era. One of the things I love is when you read them, you know how today when you get a book and you go to the back, it has the author's name, and if he has degrees, it's in parentheses, and it shows where he's got the degree from, and it says that he serves at such and such college, or he serves as the pastor of such and such church, and he's written other books. So there's a little blurb about him that gives him the credentials. But in the Puritan era, they could have done that. A lot of them had master's degrees and pastored and lectures at college. All it says was, Jeremiah Burroughs, gospel minister. I love that. Why? Because it gets back to exactly what the deal is, what the issue is. what the responsibility is. We are all collectively. Now, God sets aside those for vocational gospel ministry, but all of us, if you're a Christian here, all of us are gospel ministers. Which means what? Which means what? You better know the gospel. Right? If you've been called as an ambassador of Christ with the ministry of reconciliation, and the means of that reconciliation is through the gospel, you better be, you better understand the gospel. So that's, I'm going to get you started this morning. We're not going to say everything we can say in terms of understanding the gospel, but we're going to get you started this morning. And as I said in this first session, we're going to look at in an Old Testament perspective, but we're going to look at it through a text. Okay? So we're in Hebrews now. Hebrews 2, if you're not there. Hebrews 2, verse 16. In fact, for this morning and the next session, it's going to be these two verses. Hebrews 2, verses 16 to 18. Let me just read it for us. For assuredly, or clearly, he does not take on the nature of angels, but he takes on the nature of the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. Now, just a couple things right away. You may have been looking at me funny when I read verse 16, because I'm sure you didn't have the translation of what I read. Let me read verse 16 again. For assuredly, or clearly, he does not take on the nature of angels, but he does take on the nature of the descendants of Abraham. I'm guessing you have something a bit different. I had a look. New American Standard, New King James, English Standard Version. Most of the English versions, I don't know what the Korean says, but most of the translations read this. For assuredly he does not give help or give aid to the angels, but he gives help or aid to the descendants of Abraham. You have something like that? Now, you say, well, what Bible are you reading from, Todd? Is this the King Todd version? No. I'm actually reading the old English. Well, actually, the early church had the translation that I read for you. Even the Reformers had the translation I gave to you. The translation that you have is fairly recent, just so you know. Again, let me read you what the early church and the Reformers had. For clearly, he does not take on the nature of angels, but he does take on the nature of the descendants of Abraham. I believe that's a better translation, and I'm going to tell you why. The verb there, where you have does not give help, and I read it as does not take on the nature of man, the verb take on, and you notice it's twice. He doesn't take on the nature of angels, but he does take on the nature of descendants of Abraham. Both times. If you, the translation issue is, do you translate it literally or do you translate it metaphorically? It's a translation issue. The early church and the Reformers took it on as a literal. What you have in your translations is translating it metaphorically. In other words, taking on means helping out. But let's run with your translation for a moment. Think about it. Jesus didn't come to give aid. Jesus didn't come to help the angels. Why would that be an issue? I want you to think about that. Surely he came to help the descendants of Abraham. We get that. And we'll talk about that. Part of our Old Testament background of the gospel. But I'm working our way towards that because this is key. But think about it just at the beginning. Why give help to the angels? Do they need help? Well, there's only two types of angels. There's good angels and there's bad angels. The good angels don't need help and the bad angels don't want help. Right? So it's a bit of a moot point. So why would you translate it that way? Because theologically, biblically, it makes no sense at all. The key to it, in terms of the translation, is the conjunction right there in the middle, but. You see that? For surely he does not take on the nature of angels, but. There's a contrast there. He does take on the nature of the descendants of Abraham. He's making a contrast. Here's the contrast. I want you to get this. Probably never heard this before, so hopefully this will be helpful. He's making a contrast, and the contrast is that Jesus simply is not a what? Jesus is not an angel. Jesus is not an angel, but he's human. Why does he have to make that contrast? Why does he have to make that point? Well, that actually takes you all the way back to Hebrews 1, right? Remember Hebrews 1? Go back to Hebrews 1. As soon as he gets out of the block saying, long ago and many times and in many ways God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. So he's speaking of Christ's deity here, right? If we're going to get back to the gospel, if we're going to get back to who Jesus is and have you look to him, first thing you need to know is that he's who? He's God. That's clear. And then he says, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels. See that in verse 4? Have you ever read that and thought, what? More superior to angels? Why is that even an issue? I mean, as you move through the book of Hebrews, I get these are Jewish Christians, and you're going to have to make the case that Jesus is superior to Moses. I get that. You're going to have to make an argument that Jesus is superior to the Levites and to the high priesthood, and to everything. You know, he goes systematically right through the whole Judaistic system, and he says he's better than all that. That makes sense, yeah? But why the angels? You ever asked that question? Well, what's helpful is that in the first century Judaism, now remember the Old Testament closes with Malachi, right? And there's about a 450 plus years of silence, what we call the intertestamental period. And then the first prophet of God is John the Baptist, basically. In that intertestamental period, what did Jews do during that intertestamental period? We got the close of the Hebrew Old Canon, and for 450 years, what are you going to do? Well, what are Jews looking for? Looking for their Messiah, aren't they? And so they're studying the Scriptures. They're actually writing books. They're writing books about the law and how to obey the law. They're writing books on the Messiah and how he's going to come based on the Old Testament. Now, some of it's good, a lot of it's bad. Within that first century, during that intertestamental period, they somehow, and we could speculate on how they got it, but they speculated that the Messiah was actually going to be an angel. I don't know if you've ever heard that. They speculated that the angel, and most likely they got that from Malachi 3. You can look it up later. Looking at the clock, we don't have time. In Malachi 3, and remember, Malachi is a post-exilic book. They're looking for the Messiah, and through Malachi, the Lord says, the Lord whom you delight, the Lord whom you seek, he will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant will come. That word messenger can be translated as angel, depending on the context. The messenger of the covenant, I believe, is the messenger of the Lord, which is the angel of the Lord, which is the pre-incarnate deity that you see all throughout the Old Testament, right? Every time you see the angel of the Lord. Well, somewhere in those 450 years, they tweaked that as not as a deity being, but an angelic being. In fact, to be even more specific, they thought Michael, the archangel, was going to be the Messiah. That he was going to come into the world to be a ruler. And that's why, if you look down in verse 5, look at verse 5 of chapter 2, rather. Now it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. Why does he have to make that point? Why does he have to make the point that, guess what, guys? God's not subjecting the world to angels. Christ is superior to angels because he's rebutting, he's being polemical with all that Second Temple Judaism literature, that intertestamental period. They believe, these Jewish Christians had this mindset that when the Messiah came, he was going to be an angel. And he has to refute all that. So Jesus is better than the angel. So when you come back to chapter 2, verse 16, that's why he said, guess what? Jesus came to take on the nature of the descendants of Abraham. He did not come to take on the nature of angels. In other words, Jesus, get this, guys, Jesus is not an angel. Are we clear? That's why from chapter 1, verse, what was it I said? Verse 5, all the way down to the end of chapter 2, that's 2 chapters, basically, the argument is that Jesus is better than the angels. And you ask, why is that even an issue? It's an issue because somewhere in that Judaistic thinking during this first century, they had this idea that the Messiah was going to be an angel. That's why context is important, right? Now, why is that important to the gospel? Well, it's important to the gospel because if you want to understand the gospel, you have to understand that God became what? He became flesh. Right? Who's Jesus? Is he an angel? No. Is he a man? Yes, he is. He's truly man. He's truly God, but he's truly man. So if we're going to understand the gospel, we have to, the beginning and the end of the gospel is the person of Jesus Christ. And if you don't get his person right, you're going to get everything else wrong. You're going to get the gospel wrong. And so when you come back to verse 16, again, just to bring that back into it, let me read it again with that thought. And notice how he says, for assuredly. You could translate that clearly, plainly, without a doubt, unmistakable. In other words, he's bringing the argument to a conclusion. Do you get it now, he says? Isn't it clear now? Isn't it plain now? Isn't it unmistakable, without a doubt? It makes sense, right? He, that is Jesus, did not take on the nature of angels, but he does take on the nature of the descendants of Abraham. You've got to get that. He's not an angel. He's truly man. Yes, he's truly God, but he's truly man. And then, what we'll see in the second session is the reasons why he became man. Look at verse 16. He took on the nature of man to accomplish what I call the promises of God, which we'll talk about now. That is the seed of Abraham. Secondly, verse 17, Jesus took on the nature of man to be appointed the high priest of God. As I said, verse 17, the first part of that. The second part of verse 17, Jesus took on the nature of man to atone the penalty of God. So before you understand the work of Christ, you have to understand his person and why he came. And number 4, in verse 18, Jesus took on the nature of man to assist the people of God as the great sympathizer. So all of that we will discuss, but the first thing that we need to discuss is back up in verse 16. Not just that he's not an angel, but this other aspect that he came on to take the nature of who? What does verse 16 say? The descendants of Abraham. Literally, the seed of Abraham. Lock that in your mind. I'm going to keep referring to it now as the seed. I know some translations have sons or descendants, but if we want to be literal and really get the full theological meaning behind it, it's seed of Abraham. I don't know about you guys as Bible students, but when I used to teach in Bible college, and used to teach hermeneutics, the study of biblical interpretation, I used to say, now when you read the Bible, even in the English, but certainly if you understand the biblical languages, when you read them, you need to be an investigator. My dad is a retired FBI agent. Yeah, I know people that can make you disappear. So that's what I tell my church people. I tell my church people, don't get me upset. I know people that can make you disappear. And then I do add that my brother-in-law's in the Secret Service. So it's, but my dad's a retired FBI agent, and part of what I learned watching him is thorough investigation. And then my point here is that when you are a Bible student, being a thorough investigator is learning the art of asking questions. That's investigation. When you go investigate something, you ask questions. And so when I used to teach biblical interpretation, I said, we can teach you the historical principle. We can teach you how to read, understand the historical background, cultural background, and all that. But the fundamental thing is ask questions. As you read the text, ask questions. Now, I come to verse 16, and if I get the translation right, the first question I already asked is, well, he doesn't take on the nature of angels. Why is that even a point? Right? Why would he even say that? Who cares? Angels. Why would he want to take on the nature of angels? Well, again, then that would lead me to the historical study to say that that's actually what they believed back then, that the Messiah might have come to be an angel. But the second half of that verse is, why does he say he takes on the nature of the seed of Abraham? Is that significant? I mean, he could have said he took on the nature of the seed of Adam, couldn't he? That perhaps would have gone back to Genesis 3:15. Everybody know what Genesis 3:15 is? Genesis 3:15, where that's the first gospel, isn't it? The proto-evangelium, as the theologians say. The first gospel where God says that you, talking to Satan, you may nip him on the heel, but he, the Messiah, is going to crush you on the head. That's good news. And that's coming through the line of Adam. So he could have even said the seed of woman. He could have said the seed of Adam. He could have been picking up, these are Jews, right? They could have been picking up the line of David, the promise of David. Where's the promise of David? The Davidic covenant, the Davidic promise that there was a Messiah going to come through David, right? So why didn't he even say the seed of David? Or just the seed of man? Or nothing at all? Why does he say the seed of Abraham? Any ideas? Well, I'm going to tell you why. All right? This is the gospel in the Old Testament. If you understand why he says Jesus took on the nature of the seed of Abraham, if you understand that, then you'll understand the gospel in the Old Testament, which was my assignment. It's a long way to get there, but we're going to get there now. To unpack it all, if you're taking notes, I've got 5 points that I want to give you. Okay? Here's the question. What is the significance with Jesus taking on the nature of the seed of Abraham? We know he's not going to take on the nature of angels, right? That's not even an issue. We know he's going to take on the nature of man, and he has, but he words it in a way that is theologically significant. The seed of Abraham. What's the point with that? So I've got 5 points, 5 truths. What I call, by the way, a theology of the seed. If you have an understanding of the theology of the seed in the Old Testament, you have a theology of the gospel in the Old Testament. Here's the 5 points. Let me give them up front to you if you're taking notes, and then we'll work our way right through them. First of all, I want to give you the presentation of the seed. Secondly, I want to give you then the promise of the seed. Thirdly, the pattern of the seed. And don't worry about it if you're not getting it all down. Of course, we're going through them again. So presentation, promise, pattern. Fourthly, the people of the seed. And then fifthly, the person of the seed. This is the gospel in the Old Testament. This is the background to why the writer has to, why he makes this point, because he's talking to Jewish Christians, right? And if they want to persevere, if they want to go forward, he has to point them back to the Old Testament and say, this Jesus, he's coming out of the line of your forefathers. Obviously, you're the people of who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All the promises that were given to Abraham that then followed through David and so forth and so on begins here. So let's work our way through it. First of all, as I said, The presentation of the seed. The presentation of the seed. Now, again, just for the sake of time, just listen. I don't have time to give you, take you to all the verses, so you just listen to the verses. But first of all, when we talk about seed, let's talk about the word itself. Who here is taking Hebrew? Dennis, Hebrew? How's your Hebrew? Do you remember what the word for seed is in Hebrew? Just put Pastor Dennis on the spot here. What's the word Hebrew? What's the word seed in Hebrew? Oh, you didn't take Hebrew. Okay. Well, I do offer a class on Zoom every Thursday night. You can hop in. Yeah. When COVID kicked in and everything was closed up, some of the guys at church asked if I would teach them Greek. And I said, I could, but I love Hebrew better. You guys want to take Hebrew? They said, sure. So I started off with about 15 guys every Thursday night. And now we're down to 2. They just drop off because they see how hard it is. But we're still going for the last 8 months. So every Thursday night, well, too late. We'll do the next round with you. The Hebrew word for seed is zerah, okay? That's for free. I won't charge you for that. Zerah. Zerah, in the Old Testament itself, just in the Old Testament, 172 times. That's significant. Can I remind you that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well, the Old Testament was not written for the eye, it was written for what? Not everybody had a Bible in their laps, did they? You only had one Bible up at the front, and it was red. So if you were going to follow along, you had to listen carefully. And so the biblical writers would write in a way to make sure they got their point across. And one of those ways was how? You're a parent. If you want to make sure that your kid gets the lesson, you what? Repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. 172 times, I think, is getting a point across. In fact, in Genesis alone, 59 times. Just in Genesis alone, 59 times. The first time we see it is in Genesis 1 in creation. Let me just read you the verses. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetations, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. Genesis 1:12. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them. Genesis 1:29, then God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. Now all of that, by the way, is preparation for the important use of the seed when you come to Genesis 3, which is where? Verse 15. They already have an idea of what seed means, because when God talks about seed in Genesis 3:15, they have an idea of what that means. Because Genesis 3:15 means this. Or reads this, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. Isn't that interesting? He could have said between your son and her son, or you fill in the blank. But he uses this word, zerah, seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now we'll say a little bit more about seed in a moment, but the thing that I want you also to tuck away here is that seed can either be used singular or it can be used plural. Zerah, depending on context, is either singular or plural. It's like sheep. Hey, there's the sheep. Am I pointing to one or many? Could be either or. So seed can be used singular or plural depending on context. Just tuck that away and I'll bring that back up later. Now tied to this seed, especially in Genesis, is another word that pops up and really becomes the chapter heading or the structures all throughout Genesis, and that is what? Anybody when's the last time you read Genesis? When you read Genesis, you read a narrative and it stops, and then there's a what? There's a what? The whole book of Genesis, not just chapter 1. There's genealogies, right? You hear the story, and this is the genealogy of so-and-so. So-and-so begot so-and-so. And again, we can't read the names because the names aren't normally our names, and so it's a bit difficult. And even if you could read the names, you think, what's the point? Who cares? But here's the point. It is significant. Because tied to the seed is the genealogies. The Hebrew word, I'm not going to put Pastor Dennis on the spot again, because if you didn't know what zer seed was, I'm not going to tell him what generation is. Toledotes. All right? I'm teaching some Hebrew this morning, all right? You getting this? Toledotes. Toledot. This is the Toledot of the heavens and the earth. This is the Toledot of Adam. This is the Toledot of Noah. This is the Toledot of the sons of Noah. This is the Toledot of Shem. This is the Toledot of Terah. This is the Toledot of Ishmael. This is the Toledot of Isaac. This is the Toledot of Esau. This is the Toledot of Jacob. And then Genesis stops. So if you want to structure Genesis, chapter headings are the Toledots, the generations, or the account of, or a better word in English, the history of. How many of you encounter people, sadly even Bible college, that tells you that Genesis isn't real history? It's all myth. It's all legend. Well, you can't say that if you take the word at face value. The Toledoth literally means the history of. The history. They're writing real history. So when you put seed together with Toledot, and I take Moses as the author here, what's Moses trying to tell you? What's Moses pointing you to? Watch this family. Let me say that again. Watch this family. What family? The family that begins where? Back in Genesis 3:15. Well, where's the gospel in the Old Testament? The gospel begins at Genesis 3:15. Your seed versus her seed. He will come from her. He will be the Messiah. He will come and bruise you on the head, crush you, literally on the head. It's a victory. Well, who is this he? Who is this seed? Follow the seed. 172 times, 59 times in Genesis. Follow the family lines. Follow the line. And think about Genesis. You start with Adam. Go to Seth. After Seth, let's fast forward to Noah. Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Who's the seed going to come through next? Is it going to be Ham? No, cursed be Canaan, the son of Ham. Is it going to be Japheth? No, but he's going to be in the tents of Shem, into Genesis 9. But it's going to come through Shem, right? Shem is where we get the word Sem, or Semite, the Semitic people. And then from Shem, fast forward through who? Noah, right? Or already did Noah. From Shem to Terah, Abraham. Abraham has 2 sons. Is it going to come through Ishmael? No, it's going to come through who? Isaac. Isaac has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Is it going to come through Esau? No, it's going to come through who? Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Is it going to come through Reuben? No. Is it going to come through Simeon? No. Is it going to come through Levi? No. It's actually going through the 4th one, and the 4th one is who? Judah. So at the end of Genesis, we've given information. If you connect Genesis 49 to Genesis, is everybody following me? If you connect Genesis 3:15, where we know it's going to be a seed of the woman, by the time we get to the end of Genesis, we got the progress of Revelation now that it's going to be through Judah. Now, as Israel's history moves on, they're looking for who? They're looking for the son, somebody from the line of Judah who's going to be our Messiah. This is why the genealogies are important. This is why when they come back from exiles, 1 Chronicles begins with what? A genealogy. This is why Matthew and Luke begin with the genealogy, because they are tracing the seed all the way back to Genesis. He is the fulfillment of the promise. Now, just to end the story there, before we get back to our notes, for a long time we know it was going to come through the line of Judah. But specifically who in the line of Judah? Well, we get that information when? Anybody want to give a guess? Huh? Did I hear it? Ron? Huh? Not in the Old Testament. Remember David? In 2 Samuel 7, tells Nathan, I'm going to build a temple for the Lord. Now he lives in that tent over there, and I've got this temple, and that's not fair. I'm going to build him a temple. Nathan that night goes to bed, and the Lord comes to him, Remember this? The word of the Lord comes to him in a vision that night and says, Nathan, you're my prophet. Don't you think you need to talk to me before you give any kind of word to David? And then comes the promise. No, David, you're not going to build a temple. Your son's going to build a temple. You're a man of war. You've got hands of blood. But here's the promise I am going to give you. And you go read 2 Samuel 7. The whole promise is what? The Messiah is going to come through you. So again, from the time of Genesis 49 to 2 Samuel 7, at least we know it's going to come through the tribe of Judah, but when and who? 2 Samuel 7 answers that question. It's going to come through David. That's why he's the son of what? David. That's why the Davidic line. That's why when you go into exile, what happened to the Davidic line? And you come back from exile, and all the promises of, and wondering what's happened to the Davidic line. So we're talking about the presentation of the seed. All right? I'll come back and talk, if that was a bit all over the place, I'll come back and tie it all together in a moment. But let's look at the promise of the seed. And basically, that's what I just did. We've looked at the presentation of the seed and the promise of the seed. And just to reiterate, the promise of the seed, we're watching a promise. A seed of the woman. Okay? The promise is going to come through a family line. The family line, that's how you read the Old Testament. This is the gospel in the Old Testament. You're following this family line from Genesis 3:15 to Genesis 9 to Genesis 12. As I said, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah. And you just fast forward all the way to David. And really after that, we're waiting for the son of David. We're waiting. And so when Jesus arrives, what's the first thing that you've got to argue for? Mary's from the line of where? David. Joseph is from the line of Judah. And in the providence of God, they go into Bethlehem, or they go into Jerusalem, but born in Bethlehem to give census. You know the whole Christmas narrative. But this is why they began their Gospels with the genealogies, to confirm that he is in the line of Judah. And if you confirm at that point, then you work your way all the way back to where? Genesis 3:15, which is the beginning of the Gospel. Does that make sense? This is, if you're a new Christian, and I'm going really fast, I know, but if you're a new Christian, you can at least see how all the dots are connecting. There's a unifying theme throughout the Bible. Yes, the unifying theme is the gospel, but breaking it down, it's a family line. We're tracing this family line. Now, the third point I have here is the pattern of the seed. And I find this very interesting if you read closely. When you go back to the Pentateuch at least even into Genesis, not only does Moses want us to follow the seed family itself, but he also wants us to pay attention to reoccurring patterns. And there's at least 5. And just to make it easy, and I love alliteration, they're all begin with the R. Okay? The first is reliance. One of the things you notice in patterns as you move through this family line and watch this family line, the first thing you notice is that there's a reliance on God. I love that. Probably one of the most important verses in the Old Testament as it pertains to this family line, as it pertains to the gospel, is Genesis 11:30. What's Genesis 11:30 say? Sarah was barren and she had no child. Think about that. Abraham is going to be the father of a great nation coming in Genesis 12. Right? That's the promise. But his wife is what? Without. How do you give a promise to someone, to a man, and say you're going to be a father of a great nation? And the seed promise of Genesis 3:15 is actually going to come through you. But then the comment that your wife is barren and she had no child. What does that tell you? That this family line is dependent upon and relying upon who? Upon God. Upon God. So first thing we see in this pattern of this family line is that they're reliant. The second is relationship. In other words, what's the common denominator with all of these points of the family line? All these men, from Enoch to Noah to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. What's the reoccurring line that they have about them? What did they do? They walked with God. Go read it. They walked with God. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. Abraham walked with God. Jacob, Isaac, they all walked with God. And more than just walking with God, God made covenants with them, right? Joseph, he had a special relationship with God. So reliance, relationship, and then I love this part, resemblance. Resemblance. In other words, there's a canny resemblance between the seed and the one who produced it. In other words, like father, like son. By the way, on the negative side, you could say the same thing. Remember Jesus in John 8? You are of like your father, what? The devil. And you do the deeds of the devil. The sons of God and the sons of the devil, 1 John says, are obvious. Why? By their deeds, by their fruit, they will be known. So when I make the point resemblance is when you follow this family line, it's not perfect, of course, but there's a resemblance of godliness. There's a resemblance of the one who has produced it. A fourth pattern is rivalry. That goes back to Genesis 3:15. When God says there will be enmity, anybody know what the word enmity means? You have with enmity, there's a hatred, there's a rivalry, there's fighting going on. You know anybody that, when I said I went to UCLA, we had a rivalry, USC. So all the football games, it was, USC. Genesis 3:15, it says that there's going to be a rivalry between Satan's seed and the woman's seed. In fact, the literal Hebrew has a brood hatred. A brood, what do you mean by that? It means it's going to go on and on and on and on. And here we are all these years later since Genesis 3:15, and it's still going. A brood hatred. And then the fifth R, in terms of a pattern, is righteousness. And this goes back, in some sense, to the resemblance. What marks especially the seed of the woman as a pattern is the pursuit of righteousness. Why is that? Because they understood the gospel. Now, would they call it the gospel? Maybe, maybe not. We call it, because we're on this side of the canon. But they understood, let's say, the promise of God. And I'll show you that next. The people of the seed. The people of the seed. We've looked at the pattern of the seed. We looked at the promise of the seed. Number 4 here, the people of the seed. Real quick. Seed is very important. The seed is, no pun intended, the seed of the gospel in the Old Testament. If you don't have a theology of the seed and you don't have a theology of the family in Genesis, you don't have the gospel. Which is why I say it comes to the people of the seed. And remember what I said, seed can either be singular or it can be plural. Go to Genesis 12 for a moment. Go to Genesis 12. This text is critical. Not just for Genesis, but really the whole Bible as it relates to the gospel in the Old Testament and this seed theme and family line. Look at Genesis 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, he's not Abraham yet, he's Abram here. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country. Now that's an imperative. That's a command. And force is go, get away, break away. Now, why is there such a force there? Even an urgency there. Think about it. Before Genesis 12 is what? Genesis 1 through 11. What do you have in just 11 chapters? You have a rebellion in Genesis 3. You have a rebellion in Genesis 6 through 9 that brought on the flood. You have a rebellion at Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. In other words, from the time of the garden, placing man in the garden, to Genesis 11, you have man getting consistently what? Worse. In fact, what's interesting, if you follow it closely, every time man gets worse, the picture is that man goes east. When he was thrown out of the garden, it specifically says he was thrown at the east of the garden. When Cain killed Abel and God drove him out of the land, it says that he went east. When they came out of the ark, they headed east. There's this motif of heading east. What's east to the Hebrews? Babylon. In a metaphorical sense, it's that the picture is evil. Evil's east. They head east. East is moving away from God. That's why when you come, this is the significance of Genesis 12, because when you come to Genesis 12, God says what? Go west. Isn't that a great picture of repentance? In other words, when you come to Genesis 12, it's like God says enough is enough. Man keeps continually getting worse and worse, spiraling down in his evil. I mean, he regretted that he made man, and so he flooded the earth, right? And then he sees in Genesis 11, he comes down and he sees they're all of one tongue, really of one mind. They have one mind. They're thinking alike. This is where we're heading back. Revelation talks about how at the end of the times there will be of one mind. The Babylon will be reinvented, as it were. And people take that as a literal Babylon. It could be, but I take that as more of a metaphorical Babylon, going back to Genesis 11, where the whole world will be of one mind. And we see that, right? The whole globalization of the day, everybody's thinking alike, acting alike. Ephesians 2 says it's run by Satan, the course of this world. There's a certain course that everybody's following. Genesis 12, God says enough's enough. And he says break away from all that. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's home to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. Notice all the I wills. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And then here it is, watch this. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's what we call a divine passive. In other words, Abraham, through you, this is what I'm doing, God says. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And then I love verse 4. So Abraham went forth as the Lord spoke to him. In other words, he what? He obeyed. He obeyed. Hebrews 11 says, by faith, right? By faith he went out. Faith in what? Obedience. Trust and obey. Here's the point here. When we talk about the people of the seed, we're talking about people that trust and obey. That's what makes the people of God. They trust and obey. Paul says this exact same thing over in Galatians 3. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are the what? The seed of Abraham. The seed of Abraham. Those who are of faith. We don't have time, but if you went back to the book of Galatians, the whole argument there and why Paul wrote that is because Judaizers came in to distort the gospel, right? And he wrote it to give them the truth. Twice he says, I'm writing to you the truth of the gospel. And here's the truth of the gospel. That if you are a Christian, if you understand the gospel, you are a son of Abraham. And why are you a son of Abraham? Because by faith he obeyed. He didn't have any kind of dietary laws. He didn't have circumcision. He didn't have to jump through any hoops. Because this is what the Judaizers came to do. They placed a burden, they placed a yoke on them. They said, you got to do the works, right? Here are the rules, here are the laws. But if you're a true son of Abraham, then you understand the gospel. Because it was by what? Faith, and faith plus what? Faith plus what? Okay, that's a trick question. All right, good. You're awake and you got it right. Faith plus nothing. Faith plus nothing. I told you seed was singular, and I told you seed was plural. If you're a son of Abraham, we're part of that seed, which means seed taken in that context is what? Plural. But seed also is singular. And that's point number 5, the person of the seed. The person of the seed. Turn your Bible to Galatians 3 for a moment. We're going to wrap this up pretty soon. The person of the seed. And hang on, because I'm going to tie it all together at the end. Galatians 3, verse 16. Notice what Paul even says here. Galatians 3:16. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham. Now, can I just say, by the way, are you starting to get a little idea why the writer of Hebrews says he took on the nature of the seed of Abraham? Because he's trying to tie it back to the Old Testament at the beginning of the gospel. Notice Galatians 3:16 again. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to what? To his seed. That's plural. But then he says, he does not say into seeds as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is who? Christ. So there's a seed, that's a plural aspect, and then there's the singular seed. That, of course, is Christ, and that's why we say he's the person of the seed. The person of the seed is Christ. The seed promised to Abraham ultimately finds its fulfillment to Christ. Go to Genesis 15. And again, hang on to your hat because we're pulling all this together now. Look at Genesis 15. Let me ask you this. Who is the one person? There's a lot of saints in the Old Testament. You say, if I were to ask you, who's your favorite, Old Testament saint? Some of you might say, David. Some might say Jacob. Some might say, whoever. You might name a prophet. And they all might be worthy of emulation. But the one person that the Apostle Paul picks on as the paradigm of faith is who? Is Abraham. And it's because of the one verse there you see in verse 6. He believed in the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Everybody see that in Genesis 15:6? The Apostle Paul quotes that verse in Galatians. He quotes it in Romans. James even refers to it in his letter. It's interesting, when Jesus was always debating and discussing with the Jewish leaders, what did they kept saying? Oh, we are of Moses. We are of Moses. Moses is a good guy, right? The reason why they love Moses is because Moses represented the what? The law. And they love all. Pharisees love rules, right? That's legalism. They love rules. Legalism is antithesis to what? Faith. They should have been looking at Abraham as Paul looked at Abraham. And it all begins here. It says he believed in the... Now, get the full flow here, why this comment is made. And by the way, he certainly had faith in Genesis 12. That's why he left his family and took off. So why does Moses wait to Genesis 15 to make this comment about Abraham? Well, you need to get the full flow. So go at verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. Abram said, oh, Lord God, what will you give me since I am childless and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? You understand what he's saying here? He's 90-something years old now. He's already taken off from wherever he was in Ur, traveled to Haran. From Haran, then he went into Canaan. and he's sojourning through Canaan, and after all these years, he still doesn't have a son. He's got the land. Remember, he even gave portion of it to Lot, and Lot got himself in trouble, and remember, he had to go to rescue Lot back in Genesis 14. Now Genesis 15 comes around, where's the seed? Where's the son that you promised? Where's the son that's then going to give me this great nation? I'm old, Sarah's old, but look, I've got this servant of mine, Eliezer of Damascus. He's a Syrian. He's a good guy. He's a faithful guy. What if I adopt him and through him come the seed promise? Verse 4. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him saying, this man will not be your heir, but one will come forth from your own body. He shall be your heir. And he took him outside. By the way, don't miss that. Abram is speaking to God face to face. This is a theophany. This is God taking him outside, and it says, now look toward the heavens and count the stars if you're able to count them. And he said, so shall your seed be. Don't miss the impact here. It was on the heels of the promise of the seed, the promise of a son, the seed promise that goes all the way back to Genesis 3:15, that you have verse 6 that says that Abram what? Believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He was justified by the gospel, and the gospel is based upon the promise of a seed. Is that starting to come together to you now? Now you say, believe. You know, you have friends. I talked to somebody the other day on the street. Oh, I believe in God. Well, I hope you do. You're a fool if you don't. I mean, you walk outside, you look at the stars, you look at the moon, you look at this creation. Only a fool would say that there isn't a God up there. Even the ancient people realized that there was something higher than them. That's why they developed their pantheon of gods. They didn't have revelation, so they had to make it up. That's why atheism is insanity. Is this what it means when he says Abram believed God? Does it mean that he just believed that there was a God? No. The word there, believe, has the idea of fully trusting, fully committing, throwing yourself at God at his word. I mean, remember, Hebrews picks all this up. He didn't see it. He didn't see what Israel became of. He certainly saw his son, Isaac, but he didn't see the people of Israel, his seed, becoming like the sand of the seashore and the stars in the heavens. But it says by faith, he took God at his word. Specifically, what aspect of his word? Specifically, what part of the promise of God did he believe? In the context, it was what? The promise of what? The seed. The promise of a son. Let's put it all together. The promise of a Messiah. That's why he's the paradigm of faith. That's why when you look back in the Old Testament and you say, are we going to see Moses in heaven? Absolutely. Hebrews 11 says it. By faith, all those in Hebrews 11, that hall of faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. Faith in what? Faith in the Messiah. Faith in the promise of Genesis 3:15. In the progress of Revelation, then it was going to come through Abraham. Then it was going to come through Isaac. It was going to come through Jacob. It was going to come through Judah. And it was going to come through David. What's the gospel in the Old Testament? The gospel in the Old Testament, for them, is an understanding that God was going to bring a deliverer. He was going to bring a Savior. Now, can I just say as a quick footnote, and I know we got to wrap this up. As a quick footnote, when David heard the promise there in 2 Samuel 7, you know how we have these messianic psalms? We have Psalm 2, we have Psalm 8, we have Psalm 110, we have Psalm 22. All those are David's psalms that are what we call messianic psalms. I'm not dogmatic on this, but can I say I think he wrote those after 2 Samuel 7? I think once he understood that the promise of the Messiah was going to come through him, I think he became a student of the Messiah. Why else would he say that the Messiah coming is going to be a priest and the priest of the order of Melchizedek? Which, by the way, is what the writer of Hebrews has to argue for, right? Because they're looking for a priest, and the priests are all from the tribe of Levi, and the Messiah's come from the tribe of Judah, so how is he going to be a priest? And David has to argue in Psalm 110, which the writer argues throughout his book of Hebrews, is that, yes, he's a priest, but he's not a priest of Levi, he's a priest of the what? Order of Melchizedek. He's a different kind of priest. So as I said, I think David understood that this Messiah was going to come, and then he had to start figuring out why he was going to come and what he was going to do when he was come. And so, again, in the progress of Revelation, he puts it all together and he writes those Psalms. But here, in the person of the seed, who is that? The promise. Promise of the seed of the woman, who we know is Jesus Christ. But in the Old Testament, we just know it's the Messiah, the coming one. Or, go back now, let's wrap it up. Go back now to Hebrews 2:16. They're pulling it all together now. When you pull it all together, why would this have been a huge deal to the writer of Hebrews, to the people that he writes to? These are Jewish Christians. They're vacillating because of the persecution. They're vacillating because of the pressure of the family. And the writer wants them to move forward. And so what does he have to give them? He has to strengthen their faith. He has to show them that the Messiah has come. That the Messiah is Christ. That the gospel is sufficient. And he has to show them that the gospel is not something new, but it goes all the way back to Genesis. Genesis 3:15. But it also is in the promises of Abraham, because Abraham is the paradigm of faith. Abraham believed God. Believed what about God? Believed that God was going to bring a Messiah and it was going to come through Abraham. It was based on that promise that God justified him. So, when you read Hebrews 2:16 now, here's the significance. Aren't you glad we asked the question? Maybe you're not, but maybe I'm glad I asked the question. I'm glad I asked the question why does he say seed of Abraham and not seed of David and seed of Adam or seed of the woman? Why does he say the seed of Abraham? Because Abraham is the paradigm of faith. He is the one who understood the gospel. And what's the gospel? In the Old Testament, the gospel is that a Messiah through the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15 was going to come. And in the progress of Revelation, we get more and more information. What tribe, where he's born, what city he's from. I mean, you know all those prophecies. Until you land in the New Testament and it comes in the fulfillment of Jesus Christ. Again, just to reiterate, Galatians 3:7. Know then that it is those of faith that are the sons or seed of Abraham. If you're here this morning and you are a Christian, you are a son of Abraham. By virtue of what? You're not even Jewish, I know that. But you have faith. You're tied to Abraham by faith, spiritual. A spiritual genealogy, so to speak. Can I add one last thing before we wrap this up? Go to Romans 16. I have to bring this in. Look at Romans 16, verse 20. Begin with verse 19. Here is Paul wrapping up his letter to the Romans. By the way, as you turn there, can I just say this? Remember I said seed begets seed, and there's a pattern? You say, how do I know if I have faith? How do I know if I believe in the gospel? Well, are you relying upon God? Do you have a relationship with Him? Do you resemble Him? Is there a hatred for sin? Is there a rivalry? Is there righteousness in your life? All those things that you saw as a pattern of the seed throughout Genesis, if you're seed of Abraham, that should still be the pattern in the Christians today, right? But also notice this in verse 19 of Romans 16. He says this, for the report of your obedience has reached all. Isn't that good? They're marked by obedience. Therefore, I'm rejoicing over you, but I want you to be wise in what is good and innocent in what is evil. Now watch this in verse 20. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Where have you heard that before? Where have you heard that before? Genesis 3:15. I thought the seed of the woman was going to come and crush Satan under his feet. But now Paul says very clear that this is Genesis 3:15 language. So what is he saying here? Remember I told you that seed could be what? Singular and plural. We know singular, Christ is the fulfillment of that. That's the gospel. But then in a secondary sense, seed is plural. And what you have here, if I understand this right, what the Apostle Paul is saying, with every act of obedience, you're crushing Satan under your feet. You understand that? That's huge. With every act of obedience, in a sense, you are crushing Satan under your feet. What a thought. And what makes that all possible, just to wrap this up, what makes this all possible is that Jesus came. Why? He came to take on the nature of who? The seed of Abraham. Does that make sense? So when we talk about the gospel in the Old Testament, it's not just didactic that you can take him to this verse that all men are sinners, and this that it's by faith, and that this verse that says the Messiah is going to come, and Isaiah 53. We could do that, but I think a better way of approaching this, to see it in a bigger way, especially as we talk to you guys, is to see that there's a line, a thread that starts with Genesis all the way to the New Testament, even to the book of Revelation, all throughout the Bible. If anything you got this morning, you can see the unity of the Old Testament, right? But hopefully you've seen the gospel in the Old Testament that begins in Genesis 3:15, has its high peaks along the way, and one of the high peaks is Abraham, because it was Abraham that believed in God, believed in the seed promise, and that seed promise ultimately is Christ. Father, we thank you for our time, just in this hour, that we could open up your word, and perhaps we haven't ever dealt deeply as we have at least seen it in this light, and we thank you how clear it is, and perhaps there's a lot to take in, and we only got part of it. But even that last part, Father, may we take to heart that the gospel in the Old Testament, the gospel of the good news, ultimately finds its fulfillment in this seed, and we know who that became, and that became Christ. And like Abraham, we are to believe. Strengthen our faith. May we walk by faith, not by sight, nor by feelings. And may the faith be manifested in our obedience and crushing, as it were, Satan under our feet with that. Give us a clear understanding, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.